By the early, bitter months of 1915, the initial, intoxicating wave of patriotic euphoria that had swept across Europe at the outbreak of the First World War had been brutally and definitively extinguished, entirely replaced by the grinding, mechanized horror of the Western Front. The conflict, originally envisioned by aristocratic generals on all sides as a rapid, glorious campaign of sweeping maneuvers and decisive cavalry charges, had rapidly devolved into a static, seemingly unbreakable stalemate. From the freezing, mud-soaked coast of Belgium down to the heavily fortified, mountainous borders of Switzerland, millions of men were permanently entrenched in a vast, subterranean network of opposing defensive lines. The introduction of industrialized slaughter, specifically the devastating combination of the water-cooled Maxim machine gun, rapid-fire heavy artillery, and dense, impenetrable tangles of barbed wire, had effectively rendered traditional offensive infantry tactics entirely obsolete. British and French commanders, desperate to break the agonizing deadlock and alleviate the overwhelming, bloody pressure on their rapidly depleting armies in France, urgently sought a strategic alternative. They desperately needed a new theater of operations, a strategic backdoor into the vulnerable heart of the Central Powers that could dramatically alter the geopolitical balance of the entire war. It was within this climate of desperate strategic stagnation that Winston Churchill, then serving as the ambitious First Lord of the British Admiralty, fervently championed a bold, highly complex, and inherently risky geopolitical masterstroke. His vision was not directed at the muddy fields of Flanders, but toward the ancient, heavily fortified waterways of the crumbling Ottoman Empire, specifically the narrow, strategically vital strait known as the Dardanelles. The strategic logic underpinning Churchill's grand Dardanelles scheme was undeniably alluring on paper. If the mighty, ironclad ships of the British Royal Navy and the French Marine National could successfully force their way through the narrow, treacherous, and heavily mined 38-mile-long waterway of the Dardanelles, they could theoretically sail directly into the Sea of Marmara and anchor their massive naval guns right outside the majestic Ottoman capital of Constantinople. The British High Command firmly, and somewhat arrogantly, believed that the sudden appearance of an overwhelming Allied naval armada off the coast of their capital would instantly precipitate a massive political collapse within the Ottoman government. They assumed the Turks, whom they chronically underestimated as an inferior, antiquated military force, would immediately surrender in panic, thereby knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war entirely. Furthermore, securing this vital waterway would dramatically open a warm water supply route through the Black Sea to their struggling, isolated ally, the Russian Empire, allowing for the massive exchange of desperately needed Russian grain for British-manufactured weapons and heavy artillery. It was a spectacular, world-altering vision of strategic supremacy. However, the initial attempt to execute this grand plan relied purely on naval bombardment, a strategy that ultimately proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. On March 18, 1915, a massive combined fleet of British and French battleships attempted to blast their way through the strait. They were met with fierce, highly accurate fire from hidden Ottoman shore batteries and, tragically, a devastating line of undetected underwater mines. Several majestic capital ships were sunk or critically damaged within hours, forcing a humiliating Allied retreat. The spectacular, highly public failure of the naval offensive on March 18 fundamentally shifted the nature of the entire campaign. The British War Cabinet, unwilling to abandon the massive strategic prize of Constantinople and deeply concerned about the devastating loss of imperial prestige in the East, made a momentous and fateful decision. They concluded that the naval fleet could not possibly force the Dardanelles alone. They required a massive, coordinated amphibious land invasion to systematically capture the commanding heights of the Gallipoli Peninsula and manually silence the deadly Ottoman artillery batteries overlooking the straits. To execute this unprecedented and highly complex operation, a massive, polyglot expeditionary force was rapidly assembled in the sun-drenched staging camps of Egypt. Among these troops were seasoned French colonial forces, regular British infantry divisions, and a highly enthusiastic but entirely untested body of colonial volunteers from the Southern Hemisphere, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, soon to be immortalized simply as the Anzacs. These young men, many of whom had traveled halfway across the globe driven by a deep sense of imperial loyalty and an intense thirst for adventure, had spent months training in the shadow of the pyramids. They were physically magnificent, deeply tanned, and possessed a fierce, egalitarian independence, but they lacked absolutely any practical experience in modern, mechanized warfare. As April 1915 approached, This massive armada of inexperienced soldiers was loaded onto a chaotic fleet of transport ships, entirely unaware of the absolute nightmare of geographical complexity, fierce Turkish resistance, and logistical failure that awaited them on the rugged, unforgiving shores of the Aegean Sea. The logistical undertaking required to launch the amphibious invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula was utterly unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. In the weeks leading up to the designated landing date, the massive Allied invasion fleet, a staggering, chaotic armada comprising over 200 vessels ranging from majestic, heavily armored British dreadnoughts and nimble destroyers to rusty tramp steamers, requisitioned ocean liners, and countless small wooden lifeboats, converged on the magnificent natural harbour of Mudros Bay on the Greek island of Lemnos. The island, situated just 50 miles from the Turkish coastline, became a hive of frantic, claustrophobic activity. Tens of thousands of heavily armed men, thousands of horses and mules, and massive stockpiles of ammunition and provisions were crammed into the holding areas, creating an atmosphere of intense, suffocating tension and mounting apprehension. The Supreme Commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, General Sir Ian Hamilton, was operating under extraordinary pressure and with critically inadequate intelligence. He possessed no accurate topographical maps of the peninsula, relying entirely on outdated naval charts and a handful of blurry aerial reconnaissance photographs that completely failed to convey the sheer, terrifying verticality of the Gallipoli landscape. Despite these glaring informational deficits, the complex plan was finalized. The British forces would land at the southern tip of the peninsula at Cape Helles to directly assault the forts, while the Australian and New Zealand forces would launch a critical, diversionary amphibious landing further north, on the rugged Aegean coastline near the promontory of Gaba Tepe, tasked with cutting across the peninsula and severing the vital Ottoman supply lines. As the sun set on the evening of April 24, 1915, the vast invasion fleet silently weighed anchor and began its slow, ominous crawl across the calm, glassy waters of the Aegean Sea toward the Turkish mainland. The atmosphere aboard the troopships carrying the Anzac forces was an incredibly potent mixture of nervous energy, profound solemnity, and quiet terror. For the vast majority of these young colonial soldiers, this would be their first terrifying encounter with the absolute reality of combat. They spent the final, agonizing hours of the night in total, enforced silence, meticulously checking their heavy Lee-Enfield rifles, sharpening their bayonets, and writing final, poignant letters home by the dim, flickering light of shielded lanterns. The agonizing wait was punctuated only by the low thrum of the ship's engines and the cold sea spray. At approximately 1 a.m. on April 25, under the cover of a pale, waning moon, the massive transport ships halted a few miles offshore. The incredibly complex, highly dangerous process of transferring heavily laden infantrymen from the towering decks of the transport's down-swaying cargo nets into small, fragile wooden rowboats began in absolute darkness. These small boats, tethered together in long, precarious lines, were to be silently towed toward the designated landing beaches by small steam-powered pinnaces. The men, burdened with over 60 pounds of equipment, heavy canvas webbing, extra ammunition pouches, and primitive entrenching tools, sat tightly shoulder to shoulder in the cramped, freezing darkness, listening only to the rhythmic, mechanical chugging of the steam engines and the gentle lapping of the dark water against the wooden hulls. However, the meticulously planned amphibious operation began to unravel catastrophically before a single soldier even set foot upon the Turkish sand. The designated landing zone, a broad, relatively flat expanse of beach located roughly a mile north of the Gaba Tepe promontory, was intended to provide a stable, manageable foothold for the massive invasion force. But in the pitch-black darkness of the early morning, hindered by strong, uncharted northerly ocean currents and the obscuring silhouette of the coastal mountains, the entire naval flotilla carrying the first wave of Anzac troops drifted significantly off course. The small steam pinnaces, acting as the crucial guides for the helpless rowboats, entirely lost their exact bearings in the impenetrable gloom. Instead of approaching the designated, strategically sound beach, the fleet was unwittingly pushed more than a mile further north, directly toward a narrow, intensely hostile, and completely unexpected geographic nightmare. As the first faint, grey light of dawn began to creep over the jagged horizon at approximately 4:15 a.m., the men in the leading rowboats peered through the chilling sea mist and realized with absolute, paralyzing horror that they were not approaching a flat, welcoming plain. Instead, they were hurtling directly toward a tiny, crescent-shaped cove completely dominated by towering, sheer sandstone cliffs and tangled, impenetrable ravines that rose precipitously straight out of the dark water, a terrifying, claustrophobic death trap that would soon be known to the world as Anzac Cove. The serene, agonizing silence of the pre-dawn approach was violently and irrevocably shattered the moment the keels of the first wooden rowboats violently scraped against the unforgiving pebbles of Anzac Cove. High above the narrow, cramped beach, hidden entirely within the thick, prickly coastal scrub of the towering cliffs, a small, highly alert contingent of Ottoman defenders spotted the massive invasion force emerging from the mist. A single, solitary rifle shot rang out across the water, rapidly followed by a deafening, terrifying crescendo of coordinated machine gun and intense rifle fire pouring down from the commanding heights. The young Australian soldiers, violently thrust into the absolute chaos of their first combat experience, found themselves caught in a devastating, highly concentrated crossfire before they could even attempt to disembark. Bullets furiously churned the dark water into a frothing, bloody foam, and wooden rowboats were instantly splintered, transforming into floating abattoirs. Heavily laden men, panicked and desperate to escape the exposed vulnerability of the boats, vaulted over the sides into deep water, only to be dragged instantly to the bottom by the sheer weight of their sodden woolen uniforms and heavy ammunition pouches, drowning silently in the dark. For those who miraculously managed to wade through the churning surf and reach the narrow strip of sand, there was absolutely no cover, no tactical command structure, and no cohesive plan. The meticulously organized landing schedule had completely disintegrated into a desperate, localized fight for immediate survival. Driven by sheer, unadulterated adrenaline and the primal, desperate instinct to escape the murderous fire raining down upon the exposed beach, small, disorganized groups of Anzac soldiers completely abandoned their predetermined tactical objectives. Instead of forming cohesive defensive lines, they began to frantically scale the precipitous, near-vertical cliffs that loomed ominously above them. The ascent was a grueling, terrifying physical ordeal. The sandstone was friable and treacherous, crumbling dangerously beneath their heavy boots, while the dense, thorny scrub fiercely tore at their uniforms and flesh. Men dragged themselves upward by aggressively clutching at exposed roots and jagged rocks, constantly subjected to withering, highly accurate sniper fire from unseen Ottoman defenders who possessed an intimate, absolute mastery of the incredibly complex, broken terrain. The fighting rapidly devolved from a coordinated military invasion into a series of brutal, highly localized, and intimately savage skirmishes within the twisting, suffocating ravines and steep gullies. Officers were killed or entirely separated from their units, leaving young, inexperienced corporals and privates to make critical, split-second tactical decisions in the terrifying confusion of the heavy, smoke-filled scrub. Despite taking horrific casualties and facing an environment that fundamentally defied all established military logic, the incredible physical resilience and sheer, stubborn aggression of the Anzac forces allowed them to slowly, agonizingly push the Ottoman defenders back, miraculously managing to secure a tenuous, incredibly fragile foothold on the jagged ridges overlooking the landing beach by mid-morning. However, the initial, chaotic success of the Anzacs was rapidly countered by the sheer brilliance and ruthless determination of the opposing Ottoman commander, a largely unknown but incredibly talented lieutenant colonel named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, the founding father of modern Turkey. Kemal, immediately recognizing the profound strategic threat posed by the massive Allied landing, instantly grasped that if the Australians secured the commanding heights of the Chinook Bear Ridge, the entire defense of the peninsula would catastrophically collapse. Acting entirely on his own initiative and deliberately ignoring contradictory orders from higher command, Kemal forcefully mobilized his elite 19th Division and fiercely counterattacked the exhausted, disorganized Anzacs with devastating, unrelenting fury. He famously issued his men an uncompromising, immortal command: "I do not order you to attack, I order you to die. In the time that it passes until we die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." The ensuing battle for the ridges throughout the afternoon of April 25 was a horrifying, apocalyptic display of close-quarters slaughter. Wave after wave of Ottoman infantry launched ferocious, suicidal bayonet charges against the thin, desperately held Australian lines. By nightfall, the situation for the Anzacs was absolutely critical. They were entirely cut off, critically low on ammunition, surrounded by the horrific cries of thousands of wounded men they could not evacuate, and clinging desperately to a tiny, utterly exposed patch of rugged earth. As panicked Allied commanders debated a total, humiliating evacuation under the cover of darkness, the resolute order finally came down from General Hamilton: "You have got through the difficult business. Now you must dig, 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 until you are safe." On that terrifying first night, using their entrenching tools, their bayonets, and their bare, bleeding hands, the Anzacs dug deeply into the rocky soil of Gallipoli, violently birthing an agonizing, 8-month trench stalemate that would forge the identity of two young nations in blood.